Friends, neighbors, fellow citizens, this humble servant begs your indulgence. 250 years ago, that may have been the way a speaker would address an esteemed assembly such as this. With my abandonment of a barber and the ever-present tricorner hat, I've been a walking commercial for America 250 Marshall County. It's a committee of local folks headquartered here in the museum that organizes current events and excitement in honor of our nation's semi-quincentennial celebration. But today, I stand before you as Nathaniel Chipman. He was a real guy. He was born November 27, 1752. So on April 10th, 1776, Nathaniel was 23 years old. By comparison, about this time, Ben Franklin was 70 years old. George Washington, when he was appointed the commander-in-chief of the military forces of the United Colonies in June of 1775, he was 43 years old. George Washington was 43. So at this point, April 10, 1776, George Washington was 44. My objective today is to share with you a renewed appreciation of what ordinary folk might have seen and endured. However, Nathaniel was by no means an ordinary guy. He was tutored as a youngster and then on to Yale College. At that time, there's only 9 institutions of higher learning in the colonies, or at least what resembled an institution in the colonies, with none having a student body of greater than 100. They were primarily organized to train the next generation of ministers and political elite. On April 10, Nathaniel was chomping at the bit to put down the classical texts and join in the cause. True, Nathaniel did not have a common upbringing, but that's all I can share with you now. He did much in his 90 years, but if I didn't stop now, we'd have to change the title and the whole talk would be about something else. So that's the range. Today, 250 years ago, April 10, 1776, and before. We're not going beyond that. So let's get started. Problem is, where do we begin? We can point to several events that enraged the colonists and that brought us to this point. The Stamp Act in March 1765 is the first direct tax on the colonists rather than a duty on imported goods or trade. The intent was to pay for the huge debt incurred from the French, what we call the French and Indian War. The rest of the world calls the 7-Year War. It's important to note that the colonists were not so much perturbed by the concept of a tax stamp or the items which were essentially the items tax, which was essentially all paper documents and goods, including of all things playing cards. The beef was how Parliament went about it. The call emerged at this time of no taxation without representation. That concept was not new, but what it did represent at this time was a growing awareness that legitimate government could not exist without the consent of those governed. The colonists' response to the Stamp Act was swift and often violent. Now this is a cartoon, a political cartoon. The man in the middle, he's being tarred and feathered and abused. His name was Malcolm. He was a tax man. They didn't have to mess with these in 1776. But this was actually done in 1774, 9 years after the Stamp Act. And you can see that it's still irritating. The tree in the background is the Liberty Tree. It's marked that way. The piece of paper on the tree is the Stamp Act upside down as a point of disrespect. There's a noose hanging from the tree. The men in the background are representative of the Sons of Liberty. And as I said, the man being abused, tarred and feathered, it was actually a tax collector by the name of Malcolm. The boat in the back represents the Boston Tea Party, which hadn't even occurred yet, as far as my timeline. This was done in England, and it was to portray the colonists as barbarous. But the effect it had was that the colonists rallied around this and said, yeah, we're not going to take any gruff. But the tactic was to intimidate and ransack the homes of would-be tax collectors. October 19th, 1765, just a handful of months, 9 colonies met as the Stamp Act Congress, and that for the first time, they drafted a unified political stance called the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, arguing that the colonies could not be taxed by Parliament. They mentioned trial by jury instead of admiralty courts, and the right to petition for redress of grievances. This is a picture of Boston Harbor, a peaceful Boston Harbor in 1765. By 1766, less than a year later, the Stamp Act was a total failure and repealed. That was celebrated in the colonies with bonfires and parades. I was 14 years old at that time, and I remember those parades and those celebrations. But in the repeal, those sneaky British and Parliament, in that process, they passed the very next day the Declaratory Act, which pronounced Parliament had the absolute power to legislate for the colonies, and I quote, in all cases whatsoever. That phrase, in all cases whatsoever, will be visited again, not in this talk, but in the Declaration of Independence. The Townshend Acts of 1767, another effort to raise revenue with an import tax on certain goods, tea, glass, lead, paint, and paper. It was designed to address a growing and vigorous smuggling economy. And the harsh enforcement of these acts came through writs of assistance, which were general search warrants without probable cause, no expiration date, and enforced by the Admiralty courts with no jury. This led to a concentration of British troops in Boston. This portrait, this picture in the front is British troops lining up and disembarking from the various ships and coming into Boston. This occupancy wasn't official, but this effort here was meant to intimidate. But again, it had the opposite effect for the colonists. It did, though, increase the tensions considerably. This increased military occupation set the stage for the Boston Massacre on March 5, 1770. This is an engraving by Paul Revere, perhaps his most famous. It was created 3 weeks after the Boston Massacre. It's one of the most effective items of political propaganda in American history. I'll go through some of the inaccuracies. First of all, Paul depicts a straight, organized line firing a coordinated shot. Couldn't be further from the truth. In reality, it was a street brawl. It was a mob of colonists against one sentry at the customs house. Now, he quickly called for help, and 7 more showed up. Shots were sporadic. 3 died on the spot. 2 later died of their wounds. 6 others were wounded. Crispus Attucks was considered the first casualty of the American Revolution. He was an African and Native American. He had been identified in those times as a free man. But the historical evidence strongly suggests that Crispus Attucks was a long-time runaway slave. When I say long time, something like 25 years he was a runaway. Another inaccurate, the colonists are shown as well-dressed, unarmed, and peaceful. Reality, it was a large, aggressive mob throwing oyster shells, ice, and clubs at the soldiers. The engraving portrays Captain Thomas Preston with his sword up. His lips are even parted as if he's yelling fire. Witness testimony established that Captain Preston was instead in front of the line of soldiers, begging them to stop, to not shoot. Paul Revere added up here Butcher's Hall above the customs successfully in a way to further vilify the soldiers. As an engraving, this thing was easily reproduced and widely distributed throughout the colonies for years. On the anniversary of the Boston Massacre and any other thing, that patriotic celebration, that they would reproduce this. And it successfully framed the British as cold-blooded oppressors. Now, the soldiers were tried in the colonies for murder. John Adams defended all of the soldiers. One of the mortally wounded colonists, Patrick Carr, he was an Irish immigrant. He lingered for about 9 days before he succumbed to his wounds. But before he died, he had long talks with his physician, and he told him that he forgave the troops, and he thought that they acted in self-defense. Adams, of course, used this dying declaration to defend the soldiers, and all were acquitted except 2. 2 who utilized a legal loophole called benefit of clergy. By proving they could read, they recited a Bible verse and thereby earned more lenient punishment. So instead of taking them out and hanging them from the highest limb, they were branded on their thumb with an M for manslaughter and released. Adams, later in life, would describe the experience of defending the soldiers as, and I quote, "one of the best pieces of service I ever rendered my country." All lawyers should be inspired by that. By April 1770, the Townsend duties were all repealed, but the tax on tea. They kept the tax on tea to rub it in that they had the power to tax and they were going to do it. It was costing them more to enforce this tea tax, but they were going to continue on doing it, which led, of course, to the Boston Tea Party. The date was December of 1773. Now, I had a wide selection of pictures to depict the Boston Tea Party. It's a very popular event from back there. And I came across this. And this is a United States stamp that was issued in 1973. You can see it on the border. It says it's the bicentennial era. look that up. That was like, they considered that 1971 to about 1983. But I thought the stamp, it's not really a stamp, it's a sheet of stamps, 4 stamps. And the art was much better than a lot of the other options I had. Parliament responded with the coercive acts in 1774. We called them the intolerable acts. They were direct and punitive measures to the Boston Tea Party. So, upper left-hand corner, the coercive acts, among the things it did, closed Boston Harbor to commercial activities until the destroyed tea was paid for. They assessed the value of the tea at about 10,000 pounds in currency, a little less than 10,000 pounds, which equates to about $1.7 million today. Spoiler alert, it never got paid. Massachusetts Government Act abolished town meetings in Massachusetts and expanded an already very powerful king, his appointment power. He already could appoint the governor and so forth, but they expanded the positions he could appoint, trying to make a government, Massachusetts government, that was more loyal to the crown than what they were experiencing at that time. Administration of Justice Act, that allowed British officials that were accused of a crime in the colonies to be tried for it in England. Of course, they didn't have any witnesses of the event in England. They didn't have any evidence in England, and generally the cases were forgotten about. George Washington called it the Murder Act. Literally, you can commit, a British soldier could commit murder, be tried in England, and nothing happened. Especially galling was the Quartering Act, which required colonists to house and sometimes feed and supply British soldiers. And another one that's particularly galling to me was the Quebec Act. After the French and Indian War, the English prevailed, and they acquired the interests of France, most of the interests in land in France in that area. But Parliament, at this point, expanded the province of Quebec into the Ohio Valley, land that Virginia and my home state, Connecticut, had already claimed. The colonials' response in the lower right-hand corner, sophisticated supply lines were being developed to supply Boston with food, other supplies, and money even. First Continental Congress was convened September 5 through October 26 of 1774. 12 of the 13 colonies showed up. The Suffolk Resolves. Resolves is simply the word resolution plural. But the Suffolk Resolves, September of 1774, declared the coercive acts unconstitutional and void. They urged the colonists to ignore them. They urged the colonists to quit paying taxes. They urged the colonists to engage in non-importation agreements and non-consumption strategies. We call those boycotts. But the word boycott didn't exist until like 1840. So they were non-importation agreements and non-consumption strategies. But the boycotts were extremely effective against the British, against the merchants that, in commerce for the colonies, and I'm sure in England, those merchants and suppliers of goods would be chewing on their members of Parliament and to get relief. But most important was a directive to begin forming militias. Now, militias have been around for over a century at that point, but from September of 1774 to the spring of 1775 marked the birth of an elite rapid response unit called Minutemen. And it also included an arms race by everybody needed to stockpile gunpowder and musket balls and muskets and cannon, anything to fight with, both sides. And there's also a Declaration of Rights and Grievances dated October 14, 1774. But still not a Declaration of Independence. There's a few skirmishes from that point. As time went on, a few skirmishes of stealing each other's gunpowder and so forth. One of those was in December 1774, and the patriot that gave warning by horseback was Paul Revere. He had a ride 4 months before the one that we celebrated. I put this in because this happened. This is Patrick Henry in his famous speech, "Give me liberty or give me death." That was in March of 1775. I put it in because what was happening, the colonists were no longer protesting, but preparing for a siege. This directly influenced General Gage to strike out on April 18, 1775 for Concord. Of course, Paul Revere's ride to warn the colonists, but as I said, he was just as important months before that. Lexington got in the way. 77 militiamen showed up at Lexington. 8 were killed, 10 wounded. This was the shot that was heard around the world. From that point, about 700 British marched on to Concord, met 400 militia showed up. British split up a little bit, and 3 companies went to the North Bridge, where they were met with more militia. The British panicked and fired, killed 2. The Patriots fired, killing 3. These were the first British fatalities of the day and of the war. Eventually, about noonish, the Brits started to withdraw and marched the 16 miles back to Boston, being harassed the whole way by guerrilla militiamen. By the end of the day, the casualties, British had 73 dead, the Patriots 49. And the Brits had 4.5 times more wounded, at 174 to the Patriots 39. But April 19 was the beginning. April 19, 1775 was not only the beginning of the Revolutionary War, and they didn't know it yet, but it was also the beginning of the siege of Boston. I put this map. This is a map from 1775, drawn by the King's men, but I did it to emphasize what they call the Boston Neck. And you can see that the rest of that is water around it, around Boston. You can see how easy you can control the flow of people in and out just by that little bottleneck. If you go to, I've never been to Boston, I guess Nathaniel Googled it and did a map quest, and you don't see this water. This is all land now. They basically reclaimed it. They drained it, reclaimed it, and you have a hard time. But that's called Washington Street now. But it's surrounded by land. It's not a bottleneck. So on June 15, 1775, George Washington was appointed General and Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the United Colonies. This is him accepting that appointment. They didn't know what to call themselves for several months. They settled on that for a while, but finally in January of 1776, just 5.5 months later, they settled on the Continental Army. This is a picture of George Washington's commission, his actual commission, issued by Congress as General and Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the United Colonies. I threw this in. This is the earliest known portrait of George Washington in 1772. So he would have been 40 years old. Kind of accurately reflects a 40-year-old. But this is what we get used to. This is what we've grown to be used to. Older looking. That resembles the picture I used to see in the elementary, our classrooms. Or on the dollar bill, he looks, when he took over command of that army, he was closer to looking like that than he was to the other. Two days later, 2 days later, June 17, 1775, the Battle of Bunker Hill. Battle of Bunker Hill. Now, George Washington didn't participate. He was just appointed, and he was in Philadelphia, or he wasn't near Boston or Bunker Hill at the time. But the Battle of Bunker Hill was the first major formal battle of the war, and remained one of the major battles of the entire war. And it all occurred almost 13 months before the Declaration of Independence. The British technically won that battle as they claimed the ground at the end of the day, but they suffered heavy losses, which made it a moral victory for the Patriots. For example, British dead, 226, to Patriots, 115. 828 wounded Brits to 305 wounded. In the debriefing or the studying of that later in England, it was written that another such victory would have ruined us. The Patriots were so low on gunpowder during this battle. It was during this battle that enshrined the order: don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes. It wasn't like a strategy of getting. They didn't have the gunpowder to shoot, and the last charge came down to fists and bayonets and rocks. But back to the picture. It's titled, I believe, the Death of General Warren. And the Christ-like figure, and I say that because it's like there's a light on him. That is Joseph Warren. He was a doctor. At this point, he was a major general. He was in charge of the Committee of Communications that sent Paul Revere on his ride to Warren from Boston and to Warren, Concord, Lexington and Concord and countryside. He was 34 years old at this time. He is probably one of the biggest what-if stories of the American Revolution. What if he would have survived? He surely would have walked among Jefferson and Franklin, and he would have been a remarkable man. He was appointed Major General 3 days before the battle, and he showed up, but he showed up as a private, and he wanted to fight in the trenches, and they did. The commanders at Bunker Hill, when he showed up, willingly were ready to give their command over to him, and he very, very humbly said, "No, I'm here to learn from you." So they did battle. This portrays as if a gentlemanly British officer is stopping a troop from bayoneting an already mortally wounded Joseph Warren, as if that was the gentlemanly thing to do. But in reality, and with this insinuates that Joseph is being cared for by a fellow patriot, and that they would cart him off and take care of his body or render medical aid, but that's not what happened. Reality was the British soldiers recognized him as a leader in Boston, a leader of the troublemakers, and they mutilated his body with bayonets. His face, his whole body. They threw him in a mass grave, very shallow, buried mass grave. The Patriots did not reclaim control of that ground for another 9 months, but they did. And when they did, they unearthed the grave. And you can imagine what that was like after 9 months. So it was impossible to identify Joseph Warren until Paul Revere came to the scene. Paul Revere, amongst other things, amongst being a outstanding horseman, he was a silversmith, and he was also went into dentistry. He was very proud of his dentistry skills, advertised, sold things, and it turns out he prepared a bridge for Joseph Warren with a false tooth. And he could go through that mush of rotting flesh and found his bridge and identified Joseph Warren. It's truly the first forensic medical identification case documented. This, I put Colonel, that was a mistake. At this time, he was a major general. He was a commander at Bunker Hill, and he later replaced Gage as the commander-in-chief of His Majesty's forces in North America, and was in charge of Boston during the Boston siege, the end of the Boston siege. This is where you can boo. July 3, 1775, General Washington arrives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to take command of the Army. And is this picture inaccurate? It shows he arrives, well-dressed soldiers, perfectly lined, going as far as the eye can see, and then with uniform tents in the background. But as the truth was, when Washington showed up, these guys were farmers and tradesmen, and they had no uniforms. They just what they wore on their back. They didn't really even have tents. They were making shelters out of branches and cubbies in the hillside and so forth. And it was demoralizing to General Washington, and he has some private correspondence that reflects that if he had known, maybe he would not be where he was. But this was a loyalist house in Cambridge that was so frightened that that the Patriots things were happening, that he took his family and went to Boston and abandoned everything he owned. It was a mansion. It was full of nice things. Made a great headquarters for 10 months for General Washington. Eventually, the poet Longfellow. Yet again, another declaration, July 6, 1775. This one is a declaration of causes and necessity of taking up arms, a legal and moral justifications to the world and to the king for why the patriots are in armed conflict. Time doesn't allow me. I was going to read to you a paragraph from that declaration. Time doesn't allow me. But it's very clear that too, there was no desire to dissolve the ties to the empire. This was not a declaration of independence. On August 23 of 1775, King George issued a proclamation of rebellion. He's had his fill. He's now declaring at least Massachusetts is in open rebellion to the king. There was an accompanying document, the Olive Branch petition, that was based on trying to reconcile with England. But he famously did not read that, threw it aside. Some say he ripped it apart. He also, at that point, authorized the hiring of Hessian and Russian mercenaries to go against the Patriots. During this period, the conflict expanded from a regional Massachusetts uprising to a continental struggle, highlighted by the invasion of Canada and the birth of the American Navy. Meanwhile, the siege of Boston drags on. Here are a few important people in General Washington's life. General Washington, but in the background is William Lee. That was General Washington's personal slave. He was his valet. He had purchased Willie Lee in 1768, and he was always with the general. He was with him throughout the war. He rode a horse. He was an excellent horseman, by the way, and he rode a horse right behind General Washington. He was everywhere with General Washington, the entire war. He was the only slave that General Washington owned that he freed in his will, and plus he gave him an immediate $30 a year stipend. William Lee, and the right to stay at Mount Vernon his entire life, and he did, and he's buried there in the indentured cemetery. Martha Washington, wife, she began a habit of showing up where the general was in battle. She would show up in the late fall, early winter, and stay till the spring. And if you had a mansion to go to, why not? They wrote, thousands of letters probably to each other. And when he died, she burned them. And when I first heard that as a kid, you thought, oh, how terrible, how would they? Well, that was the custom, it was to burn private letters to keep things private. This is General Washington's mother. She was a strict person. She was widowed, relatively young. She had several kids. It was her husband's second marriage. But when he died, she refused to get remarried and continued on. She lived to 80. She saw her son inaugurated as the first president, but she wasn't impressed at all. Nathaniel Greene was often described as General Washington's most talented and trusted generals. He had no formal military training. After the war, he died very soon after the war, 1786, at the age of 43 of a heat stroke. January 10th of 1776, the colonists were beginning to hear about King George's August 75 proclamation of the open rebellion, the rejection of the Olive Branch, and the authorization of mercenaries. And remarkably, many said guided by Providence, the pamphlet Common Sense was published nearly the same date. Some said, well, this must have been in response to King George's proclamation, but it wasn't. He didn't even know it. King George was doing that. But it's 50 pages long, 55 pages long. The author was Thomas Paine, but it originally was published as being anonymous. John Adams was actually accused of writing it, but he begged off, saying he wishes he had the talent to write something like that. It's called a shilling pamphlet. It was short, concise, it was written in common vernacular, and it argued independence was inevitable. And here's a quote from that: "An island cannot rule a continent. Delaying the inevitable will only make it more difficult." George Washington said that the pamphlet Common Sense had a remarkable influence on the public's will to go toward independence. Henry Knox, he started as a bookstore owner, and he taught himself military through his books. As a 25-year-old, he came up with a plan to confiscate the abandoned cannon at Fort Ticonderoga in northeast New York. That was in November of 1775. No one believed he could possibly do it. He did. He ended up getting 59 pieces of artillery that weighed approximately 60 tons. As the portrait shows, he's a large man. They say he was close to 300 pounds. He was jovial, loud voice. He had a lasting impact. Fort Knox is named after him and his endeavors. Knoxville, Tennessee is named after him. Knox County, Indiana honors him. And our neighbor, Knox, Indiana, is named after him. This is a drawing of the noble train of artillery that they called it. And this is the 3-month process of bringing confiscated artillery to Boston during the winter months early. And they used oxen, they used horses, and they put them on sleds. The sleds had to be, I'm talking about the artillery, the sleds had to be created and built there somewhere in New York. So in January 1776, the noble train of artillery began to arrive. Boston's about 300 miles from Ticonderoga. Meanwhile, the siege of Boston continues. And General Washington now wanted to attack Boston. Wanted to do it over ice. You know, remember I showed you the map? That area that is now land probably was very shallow, and it could freeze over. And General Washington wanted to attack, but he would be attacking fellow colonists other than the British troops. So this is a romanticized picture of the Council of Generals, and it was probably if you compare that to the headquarters, I think it's designed, the windows and so forth, you can see there. But they counseled against him attacking Boston, and he agreed. So a couple more months. On March 4th, 1776, cannon was moved overnight to Dorchester Heights, with using primarily local labor and over 400 oxen, and they did it all in one night. They actually even made these panels of straw that they put out, and then the oxen and the cannons were behind it, and the British did not see it. They did not know any of this was going on. On March 5, 1776, the British woke up to the Patriot cannons on the heights, aiming down at the town of Boston and at the British fleet at anchor. It was unnerving for Howe and the British naval commander to be within cannon shot. Although attempted, the weather would not allow it. A British counterattack on the heights did not take place. So quickly, a decision was made that they were going to evacuate Boston. A delegation of loyalists, when you evacuate, there's preparation to do. Eventually, a delegation of the loyalists that were in Boston came under white flag to the Patriots and pleaded that they not fire cannon on Howe as they were evacuating. They indicated that Howe had said, if they don't fire on us, we won't burn Boston down as we leave. George Washington did not respond to that because it didn't come to him through military channels. These were civilians. It was unworthy for him to respond to that. But he didn't fire anyway. So the evacuation began March 17, 1776. evacuation of Boston begins. It's still celebrated today, Evacuation Day. Just so happens it falls on St. Patrick's Day, so it kind of meshes in and gets obscure, except this year. I've read they've had one heck of a party leading up to Evacuation Day in Boston this year because of our semis and thin zone. So somewhere 120 and 170 ships carried more than 11,000 people out of Boston, like 8,900 redcoats. And loyalists officially recorded about 1,100 loyalists, but probably near 2,000. 553 children, 667 women. They headed to Halifax, Nova Scotia. Many of those families never left there. George Washington is overseeing that beginning and focuses on sending, but now his focus is on sending troops to where will the British next be? And he settled on New York. And so that was quite an operation to start moving troops there. Late March, early April, he too was now marching with segments of the troops to get to New York. Everywhere they went, they were cheered. They were feted with food and drink. April 5, George Washington went in at a huge parade in Providence, Rhode Island. The moving, the marching, the warm spring weather, the warm welcome everywhere boosted spirits. Spirits could not be higher. But still, no consensus on independence. This is April. Casualties by April 10th. Let's just roughly, the British had about 3,200 casualties and the Patriots 2,300. That would include wounded and captured and missing. Now, I have not throughout this, nor did they keep track of the death by disease, but medical historians, some estimate as much as for every death on the battlefield, there were 10 deaths in the camp from disease. Now, I shall not trespass further upon your time with the length of my words, but I pray that over the ensuing months, our hearts and minds unite together as we discover or rediscover these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. During these most perilous of times, as we seek to implement these self-evident truths as a founding principle of a new nation, with a firm reliance upon the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. I am, as ever, your most obedient servant and obliged servant. I thank the company for your kind indulgence. Spoiler alert, anybody have roots in North Carolina? Yeah, you do. You know what this is? No. It's the North Carolina state flag, even today. It's not Nelson Chipman, and it's not Nathaniel Chipman. Although it does look pretty cool. But it has two dates. One, we don't need to, the top date is a little bit controversial, but the second date is April 12th, 1776, 2 days from now. And it's, North Carolina is the first colony to adopt to direct their delegates to the Continental Congress to vote for independence. Mm-hmm. Cool. First time in writing, April 12th. Things are going to happen after that. Thank you all for coming.